Olivia didn't flinch. Not anymore. Before he could react, Titan barked sharply from inside the storage unit. A signal. He had found something. Olivia sprinted forward just as the first motorcycle skidded to a stop, its rider jumping off. Others followed, forming a semicircle around her. She didn't have time to hesitate. She rushed into the unit, heart pounding. Then she saw it. Stacks of cash, weapons, a list of names, police officers, officials, people the gang had in their pocket. The gang wasn't just running drugs. They were running the entire town. Olivia grabbed her radio and hit the emergency signal. I need backup now. Outside, the gang was closing in. But Olivia wasn't alone. Titan and Shadow flanked her ready, and in the distance, sirens began to wail. The gang had made one fatal mistake. They underestimated her, and now it was over. Or so she thought, until she saw the last name on that list. Her own. Olivia's breath caught as she stared at the paper in her hands. Her name was printed clearly, listed alongside people the gang had targeted. But why? Had they planned to eliminate her from the start, or had she become a problem only after the recent arrest? The roar of engines outside reminded her that now wasn't the time for questions. The gang was still out there, circling like predators. But in the distance, the sound of sirens was growing louder. Help was coming. Titan and Shadow stayed close as Olivia stepped out of the storage unit, the evidence tucked securely in her vest. The gang members stood rigid, their faces hardening as they realized their window was closing. A few exchanged glances, silently debating whether to fight or flee. The leader, a tall, broad man with a scar on his cheek, took a step forward. "You think this changes anything?" His voice was cold, but there was an edge of uncertainty beneath it. "Cops won't touch us. They never have." Olivia met his stare, her grip firm on her radio. "Maybe before, but that ends tonight." The first patrol car skidded onto the scene, followed by more flashing lights. Officers poured out, weapons drawn, issuing commands. Some gang members hesitated before raising their hands, realizing they were surrounded. Others made a last-ditch effort to escape, only to be intercepted. The leader clenched his jaw, watching his empire crumble in real time. Then he turned back to Olivia, shaking his head. "You should have walked away." She exhaled, finally letting the weight of the night settle over her. "You should have never threatened my family." Titan let out a low growl, as if reinforcing her point. The man sneered, but said nothing as he was shoved into cuffs. As the chaos settled, Olivia finally allowed herself to breathe. The gang was finished. The corruption they had controlled would unravel, and her family was safe. But as she looked down at the list again, she knew one thing for sure. Whoever had put her name on it wasn't finished with her yet, and next time she'd be ready. As Mrs. Thompson made her way back to her house, the eerie sensation of being watched never left her. Every rustle of a leaf, every creak of a branch, felt like eyes on her. She couldn't shake the feeling that the chief knew she was close, too close. Her heart raced, her hands trembling as she reached for the front door. Just as she was about to turn the handle, she froze. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, sending a jolt of panic through her. It was a text from Greg. *, meet me at the store. Something's not right. We need to talk, *. Her stomach churned. She had no idea what was going on, but Greg's message felt urgent, more urgent than anything she had ever received from him. Without thinking, she shoved her phone back in her pocket and headed toward the store, her steps quick and deliberate. The neighborhood had grown uncomfortably quiet. Even the usual hum of traffic seemed muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. When she arrived at Greg's store, she saw him standing near the door, his expression tight with worry. His usual friendly demeanor was gone. He didn't even look up when she walked in. "Close the door," he whispered urgently, locking it behind her. "We don't have much time." Mrs. Thompson's pulse quickened. "What's going on, Greg? What's happened?" He leaned in close, lowering his voice. "It's worse than I thought. The chief, he's not who he says he is. I've been digging, don't ask how, but I found something. He's not just a cop, Mrs. Thompson. He's part of something bigger, something dangerous. They've been watching us, watching you, all of us. She felt the blood drain from her face. What do you mean? Who's they? Greg hesitated, his eyes darting toward the window. I don't know yet, but I overheard something at the station. The chief isn't just moving into the neighborhood. He's tracking someone. And I'm afraid it's you, Mrs. Thompson. It's why he's been so quiet. He's been keeping tabs on you. You've stumbled onto something, and he's trying to keep it hidden. I don't know what's really going on, but I do know one thing. You need to get out of here. Her head spun as Greg's words sank in. The chief wasn't just a cold figure. He wasn't just keeping an eye on the neighborhood. He was hunting something, or someone, and she was at the center of it. Mrs. Thompson backed away, eyes wide. But why me? Why has he been focusing on me? Greg's voice dropped lower. Because you've seen too much already, and he knows it. He's been waiting for the right moment, and I'm afraid that moment is right now. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from the street outside. Mrs. Thompson's breath caught in her throat. Someone was coming. Her gaze snapped to the door, then to Greg. He looked just as terrified as she felt. Hide, Greg whispered urgently, pulling her behind the counter. Now. They crouched low, barely breathing, as the footsteps grew louder. The door handle rattled. Mrs. Thompson's heart hammered in her chest. She couldn't let him find her. Not now, not like this. But just as the door swung open, a voice that she knew all too well sent a chill down her spine. I know you're in here, Mrs. Thompson. It was the chief. His voice was calm, measured, but it carried an unmistakable sense of authority. I've been looking for you. The door creaked open, and Mrs. Thompson held her breath, praying he wouldn't see them. The chief stepped inside, his massive figure filling the doorway. His eyes swept across the room, cold and calculating, before settling on the counter where she and Greg were hiding. For a split second, Mrs. Thompson's heart seemed to stop. It was clear the chief knew exactly where they were, and he wasn't going to let them escape. I told you I was looking for you, the chief said, his voice smooth and chilling. I need to know what you've seen. Greg stiffened beside her, his voice barely a whisper. We haven't seen anything, Chief. We don't know what's going on. Just leave us out of this. The chief's eyes narrowed, and he took a step forward. You think I believe that? You've been digging. I know it. And now you've come too close to the truth. You should have stayed out of it. Mrs. Thompson felt the walls closing in. She was trapped, and the chief was standing between her and any chance of escape. Her mind raced. What was the truth? What had she uncovered? All the pieces, the strange behavior, the whispers at the store, the odd hours, had been leading her somewhere, but she never imagined it would all end like this. It started like any other quiet afternoon in the neighborhood, until a call to the police turned everything upside down. Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who had lived on Maple Street for over 30 years, peeked through her curtains and froze. A massive man, towering over 6.5 feet tall, was standing in her neighbor's driveway. He wore dark clothes, his arms were crossed, and he had the kind of presence that made people stop and stare. She had never seen him before, and to her, he looked like trouble. Without hesitating, she reached for her phone and dialed 911. There's a suspicious man outside, she whispered, her voice filled with worry. He's huge, just standing there, watching everything. Minutes later, sirens broke the peaceful silence of the neighborhood. 2 patrol cars pulled up, lights flashing, as officers stepped out with cautious but firm expressions. Neighbors peeked from their windows, some even stepping onto their porches, curious about the commotion. The giant man didn't move. He just stood there calm, almost as if he was expecting this. One of the officers approached him, hand resting on his holster. Sir, we got a call about. But before he could finish, the man reached into his pocket. The officers stiffened, ready for anything. Then he pulled out a badge. Not just any badge, the gleaming gold emblem of the police chief. The entire street fell into silence. The officers exchanged stunned glances. Mrs. Thompson, still watching from her window, gasped. The so-called suspicious man wasn't just another stranger. He was the new police chief, and this was his first visit to the neighborhood. But why was he there? And more importantly, what was he about to say that left everyone completely speechless? As the police officers stood frozen, staring at the badge in the man's hand, the air seemed thick with confusion. Mrs. Thompson couldn't believe her eyes. The giant man who had caused her so much anxiety just moments ago was, in fact, the very person who was supposed to protect the neighborhood. But the more she thought about it, the more the situation felt strange. She had never seen him before, and she had heard nothing about a new police chief. The officers on the scene were also taken aback, visibly struggling to process the situation. One of them, Officer Matthews, finally broke the silence. "You're the new chief?" he asked, trying to hide his disbelief. The man nodded, his face expressionless, though his eyes seemed to hold a certain level of calm authority. "I just moved into the area," he explained in a deep, steady voice. "I'm here to get to know the community better." His words sounded reasonable, but Mrs. Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. She had lived on this street long enough to know the people, and she had never seen anyone like him. The tension in the air was palpable, and for a moment, no one knew what to do next. The man, still standing tall in front of the officers, seemed to sense the unease. He took a deep breath and looked around, noticing the curious stares from the neighbors who had gathered at their windows and doorways. "I wasn't expecting to cause such a stir," he said with a slight chuckle. "But I assure you, there's no reason to be alarmed. I'm not here to make trouble." But as he spoke, something in his tone felt off to Mrs. Thompson. His calm demeanor didn't match the intensity of the situation. Why had he chosen to visit at this time? And why had he caused such a stir by showing up alone in such an intimidating manner? Something didn't add up. As the crowd began to disperse, still unsure of what to think, Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but feel that she had just witnessed the beginning of something much bigger than she could have ever imagined. The questions were piling up, and the answers were nowhere in sight. Over the next few days, the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Mrs. Thompson couldn't stop thinking about the encounter with the new police chief. Every time she walked past his house, the towering figure of the man stood behind his large windows, watching her. It made her feel uneasy, as if he was always aware of her every move. She tried to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of her mind, but it wasn't easy. The more she saw him, the more questions kept piling up. Why had he chosen this neighborhood? Why had he seemed so distant, so cold? The other neighbors were equally confused, especially Greg, the local store owner. He had lived in the area for decades, and he'd seen just about everyone who passed through. But the new chief, he was a mystery. Greg had tried to make small talk with him at the corner store one afternoon, but the man's responses were clipped and almost robotic. It was like he was there, but not really there. No small talk, no warmth, just a brief exchange before the chief left without a smile or a wave. Greg couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but it wasn't just the man's cold demeanor that bothered him. Greg knew something else, something bigger. A few days before the chief had moved in, Greg had overheard a conversation in the back of the store between two of the officers from the local police station. They were speaking in hushed tones, but Greg's sharp ears caught every word. "He's here to clean things up. He's not who he says he is." The words chilled him. Greg didn't know what that meant exactly, but it was clear they weren't talking about a typical new chief. There was more to this man than anyone realized, and it made Greg nervous. Meanwhile, Mrs. Thompson's calls to the police station went unanswered. She'd tried asking about the new chief's background, about where he came from, who he really was, but the responses she received were vague, almost rehearsed. It was like everyone was covering something up. Late one evening, when the streets were quiet and the sun had dipped behind the horizon, Mrs. Thompson heard a car pull up outside her window. She peered through the blinds and saw the chief's car parked at the end of the street. He was walking toward the old abandoned house across the way. What could he possibly want there? The house had been vacant for years, with no sign of life in it. Why would he be drawn to it now? Her curiosity got the better of her, and she quietly followed at a distance, her heart pounding in her chest. As she watched, the chief disappeared into the shadows of the house. For a moment, everything was still. Then she saw a light flicker from inside, a dim yellow glow. Something was happening, and she was sure it wasn't good. But what? What had she stumbled upon, and what was the chief hiding? Mrs. Thompson's heart raced as she crouched behind a bush, keeping her eyes on the abandoned house. The faint glow from inside flickered again, casting eerie shadows across the yard. She had to know what was going on. The chief's sudden appearance there at such an odd hour made her feel like she was on the verge of uncovering something big, something dangerous. Her instincts told her that whatever was happening inside that house wasn't just some routine visit. She was certain that this wasn't about getting to know the community. It was something far darker. She crept closer, her feet silent on the cold gravel. The windows of the old house were cracked, and from her vantage point, she could barely make out the movement of figures inside. There were shadows shifting, and she thought she saw the outline of the chief standing in the middle of a room, speaking to someone. But who? Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't hear any voices. It was as if everything was muted, or perhaps too quiet to be real. For a moment, she debated calling the police, but then she thought of Greg and what he'd overheard. What if the very officers she would call were part of something bigger? What if they were all involved in something shady, something she wasn't supposed to know about? She couldn't trust them, not anymore, not after everything that had happened. The tension in her chest tightened, and she knew she had to keep digging. She couldn't turn back now. Suddenly, the door to the house creaked open. Mrs. Thompson froze. The chief stepped out, his broad frame filling the doorway. He looked around cautiously, as if checking for anyone who might be watching. Then, to her horror, he walked directly toward her hiding spot. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she scrambled for cover. She had to stay hidden, had to avoid being seen, but it was too late. He was right there. She held her breath, praying he wouldn't spot her. The chief paused, as if sensing something was amiss. For what felt like an eternity, he stood perfectly still, staring into the dark yard, his gaze seemingly piercing through the shadows. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back toward the house, disappearing inside. Mrs. Thompson exhaled shakily, not daring to move yet. She waited until she was sure he was gone. Then, with trembling hands, she pulled out her phone. Her fingers hovered over the numbers to dial Greg, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. The fear that had been building in her chest only grew stronger. What if they were watching her now? What if she had already crossed a line she couldn't come back from? It was clear that whatever was going on in that house was bigger than she could handle alone. She had to find out the truth, no matter the cost. But as she stood there, the overwhelming sense that she was being watched crept over her. And that was when she realized the chilling truth. She wasn't just part of this story. She had become its target.